Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
You're listening to Prime by Cortex, a podcast where we sit down with people from around the community, and today we're actually joined by Mournful Leper.
Good morning.
Before we actually sit down with our guests here, I do want to point out, if you didn't catch the news already, Tales of Xadia does have a release date now. You can be expecting that to drop March 29th. And as always, you can look up more up-to-date information on their website, talesofxadia.com. Now, for today's episode, I am here with a special guest today. You mind if I just call you Leper?
That's fine with me.
Mournful Leper is your sort of brand name and also your Discord tag as well. Now, today, what we're going to be talking about primarily is challenges as a new GM coming in Cortex. We'll also talk about challenges as a player in Cortex, and also how to get your players to try Cortex with you. But before we get into that, let's get to know a little bit about our guest today.
So I am Mournful Leper. I'm a digital artist and a musician and a RPG creator in the space, kind of trying to find my way, right? I came away from D&D, have a huge, long history with D&D. I started with 2nd edition, AD&D, and actually the Marvel Face Rip system were the first two books that I picked up in the 90s, and I played those extensively, and then a little bit of White Wolf there towards the end of the 90s when it was like super popular. And then I switched to 3.5. That was... I think a lot of people in my generation played the most 3.5 of like anything, and then followed that into Pathfinder. And then 5e is kind of where it started to fall apart. Not through any fault of that game. I started to encounter questions, right, where I didn't kind of have them before. I know that I was playing in a play-by-post, really, really cool event where it was like a 24-hour thing. There were dungeon masters all the time that you could interact with and stuff. And so I was in this party with like 12 other people, and it's huge combat, and I had a sorcerer character that died in the first round. And I had waited there for so long to even take that turn. And then, all these people are there, and it was this huge event, and it was like, okay, you died from massive damage and you're done for, and that's the end of the fun for you. That's kind of where I turned, and I knew that because I hadn't been running games for a while at the time. So I started looking for things to run online that I could slot in and out. I was kind of starting to build a system for myself. So I was exploring systems, and that ultimately is what led me to Cortex.
It's interesting that you say that D&D 5e is a little bit of a, I guess we can phrase it as like a turning point. Would that be accurate?
Accurate, yes.
Because I think it's like a turning point for a lot of players. In this generation, it's the introduction for a lot of people. I know for myself, I was also coming from like a White Wolf Pathfinder first edition background. And, I also had the same feelings about 5e. 5e was good enough for me to where all it took was like a single one shot to make me stop wanting to play Pathfinder first edition. But that said, I also had those same questions and same perhaps dissatisfaction as you did playing 5e. So I never really stuck with 5e for too long.
It's really interesting with 5e. I recently had a kind of a weird experience with 5e because I was kind of looking at it from a Cortex brain. I'm in a regular 5e game, and I'm trying to enjoy it, right? I'm like, how can I look at this in sort of a different way? And so it doesn't have a lot of rules. When you really, really get down to the rules of 5th edition, there's 3 pages of rules. And so at first, that was something that caught my attention. I was like, why haven't I done this before? And so I think there's so much, and I hesitate to call it bloat because that's kind of a buzzword and it doesn't mean much, but I think you might get engaged with a lot of things that aren't the core of 5th edition. And once you break it down to D20 plus ability plus modifier plus advantage, it's really, really simple. And you can do a lot with that core role, narratively, but that's certainly not the way a lot of people are playing that game.
It's not necessarily a bad thing. At the end of the day, I think there is some uniformity in the community, generally speaking. And, it really helps that there's that community there. It's such a big, robust community, and there's so many resources for someone to take those 3 pages of core rules and just really expand them. not exactly in the same way that I feel you can do with Cortex, or I mean, just frankly, a lot of other systems, in my opinion.
Yeah, there is so much to get your hands on. I think some of it might be like a lack of clarity, right? Like D&D doesn't have a lot of here's how you choose. I think Cortex does have a lot of that, right? Where you look at the system and it's all the mods are laid out for you. You kind of already have an idea of how they interact with each other. And on top of that, the Cortex handbook is not a game, right? So as we get more and more games, we'll start to see more and more examples of how those things interact with one another. Whereas the more popular game spaces where, a lot of those modulars are being published right now, maybe don't have those guides as much.
Yeah, exactly. I think Tales of Exadia is probably going to be their biggest end to date. Like, that's not to say like any of the older games couldn't, but those games are unfortunately out of print. So unless you're going out of your way to buy it like third hand, right? Like most players, I think, are going to get introduced to either a GM who used the handbook to build their own thing, or through the upcoming IPs, which is Tales of Xadia, Legends of Grayskull, and apparently there's a third secret thing in the works. I don't think we have any news on that, but that's what I'm hearing. But speaking of like, so you gravitated away from 5e. You maybe had some other games between 5e and Cortex, but what was your first introduction to Cortex? Like, what got your attention?
I was in a OSR subreddit. Somebody was asking about lasers and dinosaurs. That's why I clicked on the thread. I was like, oh, I love lasers and dinosaurs. Inside said thread, somebody was talking about Legends of Grayskull. That was my first, not even my first, that was my first, like, that's what brought me to Cortex literally directly right now. I had actually had a copy of the original Firefly handbook. And I often think about that now, like the past few months of this whirlwind of Cortex that I've been experiencing. Like, man, I wish I had kept that book around and played maybe some games from it. But after finding out about Legends of Grayskull and clicking on that link and getting to Cortex, I knew that I had to experience as much of it as I could, that I needed to start playing so that I could start learning, so that it could all start making sense. So I came to the Discord, and I can't remember what came first. I played a Marvel Marvel Heroic game, where I played a heroic variant, Victor Von Doom, which was such an incredible experience, like, hey, we just unlocked your imagination, And then my other one was with BW, and I don't know if you have any plans to have BW on the show or if anybody else has talked about BW, but what an incredible ambassador for the game that he is. But I played in one of his weekly games in the Discord server, a hack called High Pressure that he had made for Confab. Those two games, like I said, happened around the same time, and I've just been trying to, get my hands in as much as possible since then.
I do plan on having BW on the show eventually down the line. For those who are unfamiliar, if you joined the Discord, I mean, BW has their own channel on Discord where they just organize, I think it's like weekly games, right? Is it all playtesting? Are you aware?
Up to the whim of the moderator. So just recently I had been participating in just some like wild theory crafting. We were meeting once a week to just talk about Cortex, and because he made a random game generator, so we just rolled on that for a few weeks and talked about what we had rolled and what does it look like to build a game from those rolls, and what are the implications of adding these mods in this combination, and how do you use that to build this kind of drama. So it was like real workshopping stuff. But I also have played like a great number of games with BW as well, like Exiles and Whiskey Grits and Demon Spittle and High Pressure, as I mentioned. So like I said, it's pretty much up to whatever BW wants to do.
That's fair. And I don't think BW is the only person who does pickup games. I think there's one or two other groups on the Discord who do pickup games. So if you're looking to have like an introduction like Mournful Leper here, where you're just jumping into these pickup games, you can definitely find it on the Discord. So, Leper, it sounds like you're really involved in the community. I see you chatting in Discord all the time, and I haven't had the chance personally to join in on those pickup games. I do hope to eventually, but it sounds like you're just kind of throwing yourself in there. Are you mostly GMing, or are you mostly a player in these cases?
Started more as a player, moving much more into GMing now.
Mm. Are you normally a GM when you do games?
Oh yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's definitely what drew me to the hobby in the first place.
Yeah, same here. I think like the Cortex Prime handbook is probably most appealing to GMs in my opinion, because it's this menu of different rules and such to build your own thing. And if you're not the one building it, like that's not to say that's no good for players, but I think it's easier for a GM to just build their thing and then tell the players like what mods and what rules they're specifically using, because that book is a bit of a behemoth, I think.
Yeah, it really is. And that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to learn so much is because if you want to know what all those switches and dials and things do, you got to put your hands on them and turn them and switch them and stuff, right? So, that's definitely a thing. You talking about GMs and how the game appeals to a GM. I feel like it gives you the player experience in a lot of ways that GMs don't normally have. You're sharing in the storytelling, you're reacting to what's happening more than you're used to, and those reactions are less of, oh no, how do I fix this, and oh my god, that was awesome, let's run with it. It's so freeing.
Yeah, and I think it starts off small. If you've done other tabletop role playing games, like let's say 5e or whatever, and you're coming over to Cortex, I think it could start off small depending on how your GM is running things, where you're just role playing like normal. And then you hit that first point where it's like, you know what? I kind of want to figure out what this plot point thing is about. Can I just create an asset? Or maybe your GM like turns the table toward you and asks you like, oh, well, this character that you just interacted with just received a complication from you. Can you name the complication? It's like a very small but I think powerful thing that immediately makes things a little different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Prepping your games as a GM, did you find that you had to do any sort of mental switch here or take some sort of different approach to prepping your games compared to other systems?
Yeah, certainly a learning curve. I like prep, and it was one of those things that made me feel like I was a player in the game, and appealed to me as like a world builder and stuff. But a lot of times the players don't see all that prep, and you have to sort of you're reusing things, right? There's hours and hours of YouTube videos and pages of blogs on how to fix it when your players go off of the rails that you built, or how to engage with your players when there are no rails, right? Whereas with Cortex, all of that stuff is just right there in front of you. And so it's hard to get used to that. And it's hard to understand what is good prep and what your style of prep is. And then also that might even react to your players and to the build of game that you're playing. There was a really, really incredible thread on this in the Discord yesterday, actually. But once again, this is one of those things where it's very intuitive and it's very easy, but it's also so modular and so different. It really starts to become an art form where you're feeling the differences rather than just academically looking at them.
I think there are a lot of methods that can translate over to prepping a Cortex game, especially when you're new to it and you're already like juggling with the rules. The last thing you want to worry about is changing your prepping style. That said, the handbook does come with a fountain of advice
Right.
for how to prep it for Cortex, and some of this isn't necessarily unique to Cortex. Some of it, like I personally haven't read it anywhere else. So there's a lot of like solid advice. Naturally, of course, Cam Banks is not going to kick down your door and tell you you're prepping or playing the game wrong. But I think it's definitely worth a read to check it out and see where Cortex is coming from when it comes to prepping.
Yeah.
Before disregarding it completely, I think it is worth reading those dozen or 2 dozen pages that they have on prepping games, setting up scenes, and what those scenes might look like in Cortex. Like, I think, one thing that they tell you to do, or one thing that they tell you could do that I never do in any of my other games are like tag scenes at the very end.
Yeah.
Cortex is very like session centered, not precisely episodic, although it's kind of almost there. So it encourages you to do these tag scenes where you just kind of breathe things full circle, reevaluate what happened, and see if there's any growth in your characters from there. And yeah, pick things up next episode. Usually not so much on a cliffhanger, I would say, but well, I guess that's not entirely true. I definitely still do cliffhangers in Cortex,
Right.
but yeah.
It depends, right? I mean, there's so much there, right? I didn't. You asked me a question before, and I waxed philosophic on prepping D&D versus Cortex instead of answering your question. But I have come to a list of reveals, a list of things I can grab, GMCs, crisis pools, mobs with attached SFX, because like a lot of times I want my bad guys to be doing cool stuff. And if you're just making up bad guys on the fly, it's hard to have cool thematic special effects attached to them. So I kind of try to have that stuff cocked and loaded as much as possible. There was a document that got linked in the Discord. It's from Talsorian Games. It's called Scripting the Game. I only use like literally one piece of advice from it, which is alternating your action scenes and not action scenes. Make sure everybody has a chance to decompress and you're not pushing them too hard, right? That's pretty basic. But I must have read that thing 15, 20 times in like coming to that decision, and in prepping for Cortex games and like learning how I wanted to prep my Cortex game.
Yeah. And that's a key thing there is feeling out how you want to prep your Cortex game, because just like how you can dial up and down how crunchy your Cortex build is, how in-depth it is, or how lightweight it is, the same thing could be said about prep work, and that could be like session to session, not necessarily game to game, build to build, because you get so many options with how to handle, like, say, for example, characters in Cortex. Like, if you need to come up with a character on the fly, you could just quickly work out like a boss trait list for a character and then flesh them out later, or you could just do all your characters like that. I know Josh Roby said that they either used to or maybe still do use the Doom pool for GMPCs rather than making full-fledged character sheets. But you can also do that too, where you're just making a character sheet that looks just like or very similar to a player character sheet. But that takes time, and that kind of again boils down to preference.
Yeah, I really like the idea of just starting with that list of traits, because I think when you're moderating Cortex, eventually you are going to do that no matter what, is just throw somebody's name and like D8 jaunty hat, D10 attitude or whatever. I already have a picture in my head of that character that I just made from those three statements. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
that kind of thing is so fun, and once again, so enabling, and really just fires the imagination,
As the new GM coming into Cortex, what is something that you're enjoying so far about moderating Cortex as opposed to GMing other systems?
That player agency, and really, really finally feeling like that we're sharing a story together. Because, I don't think I even knew that block was in place. I thought that that's what the hobby was, that's what we were always doing. But then you kind of start to realize, the differences in, as you said, play style and table style. Like my regular gaming group that I've been gaming with for decades, like I said, we just recently had our first like session 0 where we sat down and I was like, guys, we need to talk about why we're here, like is it just because we love one another and we want to spend time together? And it's not, right? That's definitely part of it, but we're also here to play this game. So what is it that we're trying to get from that game, and how do the rules interact with that question? A point of view that I came to from Cortex, and also a point of view that you can take to any game, no matter what it is that you're playing.
Absolutely. I think I had a very similar experience coming into Cortex myself. Like, it is that player agency, and I don't think Cortex itself calls it a conversation, but other game systems do, or they say that role playing is more of a conversation. And I feel like in my own experience, I never really had conversations in quite a few of the other systems I've done. But with Cortex in a couple similar systems, like I feel like I'm finally am having that conversation, because, we had to sit there and talk about like, oh, well, you need to make it, or you want to make an asset, like how you do that, what you want to do. And then we start chatting about like what's happening in the scene, or like what's around the scene, right?
You touch on something, you roll to make an asset, right? It's so simple and one of the core mechanics of Cortex, but when you get down to it, that's a story beat, and this is something that really is more and more coming to understand about Cortex is all of those roles are so important, and they really, really matter to your story, no matter what it is, no matter if you're just picking up dice to create an asset or you're in the final encounter with the big bad evil guy. The dice are helping you to tell the story, and if you're putting hands on them, then it probably needs to be a reason. I'm doing a play-by-post right now with some new players, and so it's teaching them in slow motion, which is both harder and easier at the same time. But watching them kind of, we did our first round of making assets, and somebody's picking up a gun, and somebody's calling in airstrike or whatever, and then they get into the next scene and they didn't need any of that stuff, and they're starting to realize, oh, okay, maybe I can just spend plot points when I need them, and I don't have to have these assets laying around. I can just create them when it's right for the story or whatever. And so yeah, once again, I think when you get into playing and doing, that's when all of that stuff starts to make more sense. It starts to feel more intuitive.
You and I are going back and forth about how wonderful it has been to GM it, but Cortex can still be tricky to run, especially when you're coming from more quote unquote traditional games. What was something that you found was really hard for you to wrap your mind around from a game moderator perspective with Cortex?
I don't know that it's been any one specific thing. It's been a lot of little things. I didn't understand why the D4 stress mod existed, like how Zadia does it, where it just does away with it, right? I didn't really okay, for instance, I wasn't giving people plot points when they were including that D4. I just thought it was a cool thing. Oh, here you go, you get your complication and then it goes away. And so you can do stuff like that and do it wrong, and then suddenly you understand a little bit more about it, and then it has ramifications, throughout your entire game. So that is something that it takes some getting used to. The Doom pool was hard. I love it, right? And it's such a cool and unique tool, but actually understanding how to use it and when to spend from it and when to keep dice in it and how to carry it over from session to session was something that really took some experimentation and some reading and talking to people and stuff.
I think there's a lot of little things to remember, right? There could potentially be a flow chart here, not to make it seem like Cortex is this a huge complicated game. You can always start out easy and light, and it doesn't really break the game to forget stuff like that. But yeah, it does kind of highlight why there was that game design decision once you go a couple sessions without doing it right versus when you finally do start doing it right. I feel like there's a whole conversation or debates that could be had about is there a way to do Cortex wrong? There is and there isn't. I think that's a complex question. I don't know if we'll get into that today.
It's a whole episode, right?
Yeah, that's a whole episode. I guess what I'm saying is you can ask how to do a thing in the Cortex Discord, and I think this is a beauty of it, mind. And you'll get 5 replies, and all 5 of those replies could potentially be different angles at tackling effectively the same thing.
Yep, absolutely. And it can be difficult and confusing, for people. And it's hard too to talk about the potential pitfalls of something that you love so much,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not even my system, but I mean, I love the system so much that I had to take legit critiques of the system in stride, and just be mindful that people are coming at this game from different angles, and that is, by itself could be a disadvantage. There's a lot of people within just any game system who just struggle with a single streamlined rule set. You'll see, for example, players who will only ever play a certain class in D&D because playing another class effectively means learning a chunk of something new, right? And so that there's nothing wrong with that. People have different capacities for different things, and from that I mean not everyone has the opportunity to learn and test every single mod that's in Cortex Prime, right? Sometimes a person just wants to just sit down and just run the thing, which I think is what's going to be really appealing for the published IPs like Tales of Zadia. So I mean that's all valid.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting in there and running some Zadia. I don't have a deep personal connection to the IP or anything, but I think it's going to be so great to bring people to the game. That show is very rich, right? Like I said, for me, it's not. I couldn't quite engage with it like story wise, but the lore is crazy awesome, and it's so beautiful to look at, and the music is amazing. And so I think as a GM, I couldn't ask for more than that. And then I started looking into the pre-generated characters and stuff, and they're all so cool and so fun, and so I'm starting to get really hyped to run some Zadia and engage with some people on that level.
I feel you there because honestly, like I never gave Masters of the Universe or Tales of Visidia or Dragon Prince really, right? A second thought until I saw that Cortex was coming out with games for those. So I was like, all right, well, these are going to be the two big games for Cortex, at least on the front lines. I should check it out. I did wind up getting really into both IPs, and it's interesting how much influence like a good tabletop role playing game could do for getting people into a new IP or vice versa. If you are a huge fan of Dragon Prince, but you never heard of Cortex, like this is going to be your into a brand new system.
Trying to explain it to the guy at the comic book store the other day, I pulled out the character sheet and he said, okay, well, where are your attributes? Okay, well, attributes are here, but really, and then I'm like putting my hand around distinctions and values, and he's like, well, no, your attributes are here. And I'm like, man, I'm telling you, all of this is important and just as weighted as those attributes are. And it's exciting to engage with those kind of attitudes and maybe change some hearts and minds a little.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are just going to need to see it in action, which I think we'll probably get more and more like actual play out there once the game releases, and people are going to be able to see the game played, hopefully by their favorite streamers. Who knows? But yeah, when it comes to Cortex, there is a lot to wrap your mind around, right? Is there any like one thing that you wish you knew back then that you know now?
Just starting out with Cortex?
Yeah.
I think that you touched on it earlier, the fact that it's so hard to break and that your mistakes don't matter. Melly mentioned it or maybe they don't matter as much as you think they do, right? Melly mentioned it in the Discord that it's an ongoing process and it's overwhelming to wrap your head around the modularity. Then it's also a tool and you can also use it and you can also change the things that you don't like. This is something that's hard for me personally. Sometimes it's just to admit it, that a mistake is a mistake, and that it didn't ruin your game. It can just be something that you can change and move on.
And I think as like GMs, we can be harder on ourselves about every little mistake. But sometimes the player either doesn't notice or doesn't know or think that you're just making a judgment call because it's better for the game. And so to them, it's nothing. To you, you might be kicking yourself like, oh man, I really messed that up. The player should have gotten like 20 plot points. The villain should have been taken out, etc. But for a lot of players, that might not actually be the case. So, we got to keep perspective here at the table.
For sure.
From a GM perspective, would it be accurate to say that it has been a sort of guess and check or learning as you go situation?
Yes, absolutely.
And it sounds like you're getting a lot of game time as a player. Have you found that your experience as a player has been different compared to other systems?
Well, for sure, right? Yeah, we talked a little bit already about how much, power that you have as a player. And so the way I think of it sometimes is when I first discovered point and click adventures in the 90s, and the idea that a video game, for example, didn't necessarily have to have a linear gameplay, and that you could represent yourself just exploring, just touching things in the world and being there in like a real way that you hadn't experienced before. And I think being a player in Cortex is a lot like that. If you're not used to it, you're like, oh wow, I can do all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a level of like authorship that I think comes with the role of player that you see in some other games. But given that Cortex has the meta currency, the plot points, and then just other mechanics that are just baked in the core of the game, like it's all there, and it's all could potentially be a bit much. Did you find that you had any problems getting your players to switch over?
I honestly started with new players, and that was easier for me than getting players to switch. I'm having more and more success as I go along. I got some of my grognards in a play-by-post now, I mentioned, and so I'm once again teaching them in slow motion, and they're getting into it. The shared fiction aspect is really cool because we can explore those nuances where, if you're at the table and you're put on the spot, what does your character do? Sometimes it can be hard, and you've got that choice paralysis and you're building a pool. Whereas in a play by post, it's like, oh, okay, I can really kind of lean into this and develop the fiction. So I hooked them that way. And now I got to schedule a voice chat with those players so that we can get on the same page with rules, because now they're hooked. Now they're really, really into it, and they're starting to ask questions. Like, how do I challenge my relationships, and how do I push stress and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's interesting that you made the switch through play by post, because it does give you some breathing room to think through stuff, and there's not a whole lot of pressure to know a rule like right then and there. You have some time to just look it up, or just you don't have to stress yourself out about it. I personally find that if, like, for our listeners who don't do play by posts but are struggling to get their players to, I mean, honestly, switch to any other system, much less Cortex, right? I find that helps to just kind of pitch it, like the scope of the thing that you're doing. Like, hey, do you mind if we switch over to this new system? I really just want to do 1 or 2 sessions, and if you don't like it by the end of like session 2, we can switch back or figure something else out. I find that helps a lot for really just any campaign, just to know like the level of commitment that's expected of the player, right? You say you're going to switch over to voice chat. Are you just going over rules, or were you going to like
Yeah.
actually run a live game? Mm-hmm.
No, just going over rules. But as I say, that was significant for me in that they had an interest, and that they're trying to do new and fun things with their characters.
Now, our experience as to what new players tend to have trouble with might be a little different here. Are you finding any particular thing that your players are getting hung up on?
No, I wouldn't say so. And this is I think a function of I had the one regular game, but other than that it's been real piecemeal, and I haven't had as much time as I like to really focus on building a rapport, both with the game and with the players, right? And so I think when you have new people, there's going to be a variety of questions, and like everybody kind of might be having trouble in different spots. But if you're working on something regular, you can really like fine tune where the problems are. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe a certain player isn't understanding a certain thing, and you can help with that rather than just answering a bunch of general questions all at once.
Right. Yeah. When I approach teaching Cortex, and I've slowed down in recent months with playing with random people, but there was like a hot minute there where I was just playing games with random people all the time and just introducing them to Cortex. Yeah, I think a couple of things that I found players were having trouble with were like, one, if you're not used to a game that has meta currency, that's a whole thing, right? So I had players that would struggle with even remembering that they have plot points, for example.
Yeah. Plot points is big. Hitches, right? And bad things happening on their turn. You know what I'm saying? Like
Hmm.
buying a hitch and applying a complication to somebody, or applying stress to somebody, or doing whatever it is that you're doing with that hitch. It can be hard both for players and for moderators to sort of get used to that kind of thing happening.
Right. I'm thinking back to it now. Josh Roby, who we've had on the show before, they have a project that's supposed to be very new friendly, and I think they were saying that they weren't even introducing plot points until second session or the second chapter of what would be this pre-written adventure, I think, or campaign
Right.
frame.
Yeah, I think I believe it's level 2 as well, because that's the distinctions one, right?
Yeah, I know it's interesting because there is like a fairly sizable list of things that you could be spending your plot points on. I've done everything from making a reference, like I made like a little flow chart that's like, oh, if it's before the roll, these are things you could do. If it's after you've already rolled, these are other things that you can do. And yeah, I mean, that's still like a lot for the player to like look
Right.
at. I find that's more useful to just let them know that plot points are a thing and then kind of coach them through like, oh, well, if I were in your shoes, I might be looking to spend a plot point on such and such, or wait to spend a plot point until after that. And like, I think players really start thinking about plot points when their character is backed either in a literal or figurative corner where things are getting harder. It's like, oh crap, what can I be doing to make things easy for me?
I mentioned it just a little bit earlier. You start to be more aware of your plot points and spend them a little more according to your own style when you do things with them that you didn't want to do. You know what I mean? Like when you have busted that plot point and you think later on, like, oh, I should have done this instead. Or, when you start to understand a little better what the potential is, I think that can be a real motivator to maybe not do things the quote unquote right way, right? But to do things that are more satisfying to you as a player, It's building a pool, right? That is one of my favorite things to engage with a new player, a teaching tool, that first scene where you first pick up the dice. And so, in my experience, or the way I like to do it is, you've had, everybody's together, you've maybe done some role playing, and you've sort of showed people that they can introduce things into the narrative and there's a freedom there. You know what I'm saying? You want a magic sword, you got a magic sword. Okay, good call. And then the first time you pick up the dice and start going around and explaining what goes into the role and how to build your pool and how you can get extra dice into it and stuff like that. That I think is a really good place to teach new players as well.
What trait sets are you using for your play-by post? Because another thing I find that players might have difficulty with, or like the more abstract traits, the most common one being distinctions, right? But also having issues with like values. I think relationships kind of are easier to handle, but it's still like
Yeah.
this abstract thing that I think a lot of players never actually seen as a stat, right, on their sheet.
So I got ambitious, and it was a function of having Cortex brain and not new person brain. So my distinctions are pretty accessible. I have guides, right? It's background and heritage, vocation and occupation, and the last one is morality or philosophy. And then I have I'm calling them roles, but it's attributes. The roles are strong, tough, fast, dedicated, smart, charismatic. I stole them from D20 Modern. Those were the classes. And then relationships. And relationships, like I love relationships. If I could have them as a prime set in every build, I would. I just love what it does to the table. You know what I mean? I love being a moderator for that drama. So they have really taken to them surprisingly, but the challenging and the statements is something that we're working on. And then I got resources on there, which again was a tactical error, trying to explain to people that they're rolled separately and you only keep one of them and it goes onto your total and it's not available as an effect die and the hitches don't matter. It was a lot of fiddly bits.
Yeah.
For me to put on there. But that's basically it. So like I said, I was trying to make this kind of streamlined build, but ultimately tripping all over myself anyway.
Yeah. No, it's funny that you say that because you could absolutely just try like to build your game. I guess a way to phrase it is like wide, where you're using all these different elements, which I think technically they're all supposed to work together. Whether to that degree, I'm not sure how far along you can get before stuff breaks down. But like when you're dealing with like new players, I imagine it kind of feels like you're almost gaslighting them. It's like, oh, remember
Yeah.
how this trait worked? Well, you got it wrong
Except
because
in
yeah,
this situation,
yeah,
right? And because I spent a die from my doom pool, that's right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I feel so bad. And that's why we're doing this voice call, because I'm like, oh, you poor dudes. And
yeah.
they're so trusting and they're just going along with whatever I say. So we gotta clear the air.
Yeah. I mean, just imagine like you think you're finally getting stuff right, and then at the end of the session or at the start of next session, there's all of a sudden this thing that contradicts what you
Hmm.
thought was good. Especially like if you were already primed by the fact that there are like all these optional rules that you could be doing. So I think a thing to like curve that maybe is just having a menu of things that you're using for your game and telling them where to look it up, or maybe just introducing it incrementally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, you can keep it simple to just the three prime sets or two or three prime sets that you're using for your game, and then introduce this new thing later on in the next session. So I guess taking a Josh Roby approach, right?
Right. And it's they say everybody says it and nobody does it. Start with hammerheads, right? I'm guilty as well. I didn't do it, but looking at it, the more I turn around and look in the rear view at hammerheads waving at me like this was the way. It's really built, for accessibility. It's got, there's not much to it. It's, you make a couple decisions at the beginning and then you just run in and start playing Cortex. So I hope to use that more. And then also there's Zadia too, and Zadia, we talked about a little bit, has a cultural kind of handle on it that maybe will help people learn as well.
Yeah, I wonder like how much a specific player's experience colors how they're learning the game. Because in my opinion, if you have previous experience versus like no experience with tabletop RPGs, like to me, like it seems like a world of difference. Like I mentioned before that I was playing with a bunch of random people. Like there was a solid like 2 or 3 years where I think on average I was just playing with one, my regular group. I wasn't always playing with random people, but talking to 30 to 50 players over a given year about different game systems. And in my experience, like if your experience is only doing like say D&D 5e, to me as someone who does all these different systems and who's playing with all these random people, like I can tell when your experience has only just been 5e or has largely just been 5e, because you treat the game differently when you're coming from a experienced background, whether it is D&D or like a Shadowrun or some other system, as opposed to someone who's never done a role-playing game before. I actually find that they tend to have an easier time understanding the rules because they don't have like their cups are empty, as it were, right?
Yes. Right.
They don't even need to empty their cup because their cup is already empty. So I guess that's the point I'm trying to get to is like if you're a player struggling with Cortex, but you don't struggle with other systems, like empty your cup.
Yeah, no, that's unlearn is a huge part of learning Cortex. And if you don't have to unlearn, then yeah, you definitely have that advantage for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you know that the person who wrote your game is also a philosophy major, right?
Yeah. Well, first off, they're going to give you a trait set that's just different philosophers.
Yeah.
Rate your die for it. Yeah.
I love it.
Well, Leper, it's been great having you on the show. It's something I've been wanting to do to get the perspective of someone who's just coming into Cortex onto the show. So I'm glad I was able to have you on here. Where can listeners find you and your stuff?
Well, thank you as well. I really appreciate you having me. It's been such a fun conversation. I'm sure you can tell I have such enthusiasm for the system. I appreciate you indulging me. If anybody's interested in finding out more about Mournful Leper, I have a website, mournfulleper.com. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Patreon, of course, Fiverr. I'm in all of those spots. Just trying to get out there. This whole thing, Mournful Leper, has been a project for me that I was feeling some imposter syndrome. I've been a artist and a musician my whole life, and didn't have a lot to show for it. So I really wanted to just make a repository for all of my artistic things to go into. It's been really great. Once again, a learning curve. Certainly, I've made some missteps and had some difficulties, but also really enjoying it. And the returns have been incredible. Meeting people, doing things like this. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask you one last question actually before we sign off. You have this website and this brand going. Can we expect one day a creator studio Mournful Leper label?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, thank you for asking that question because maybe I want to talk specifically about what it is that I imagine that I do, right? So, my first big project that I released is called The Doorway in the Hill. The Doorway started as a record. It was all the electronic instrumental tracks, not all of them. Like, there were probably 40 songs that I started with, and I boiled them down to the ones that are on the album. And then I made a video to go with it, which was really, really fun. And then I knew I wanted there to be a TTRPG aspect of the project. So I unfortunately started working with some really, really great people on something before realizing that it didn't have anything to do with the album that I had written. And that what I really wanted to do was to make something that made the whole thing a piece with all of the elements that I imagine that I do, you know? And so I created Codex and Coda, which is a OSR piece. It's written in AD&D. The reason why I did it that way is because it makes a retro 90s kind of vibe out of all of the Doorway in the Hill itself. So the reason why I mention all of that, other than obviously to promote it, is that's kind of what the main thrust of what the next thing is going to be. Hopefully later on this year, I start work on the second album, which is more of a Black Sabbath-y kind of like metal album. That'll have a video and a game to go with it as well, which will be primed by Cortex. But that's like, that's a big thing. I have a couple of Cortex games that I've been working on in the meantime. So the Creator Studio definitely is going to have a lot of Mournful Leper project on it, knock on wood.
You heard it here first, folks. Be sure to check out Mournful Leper's site, and we'll include all that information in the show notes. To also include Prime by Cortex, which, if you're already here, you already know how to find us. So that's the thing. But you can always reach out to us through Twitter or email. If you want to be on the show, talk about something, or you want to see specific topics, just hit me up. I'm open to it. And, we might be looking at more actual play opportunity. It sounds like a lot of folks dig the last miniseries we did. But yeah, if you want to have some input on that, because nothing's set in stone right now, hit me up. And maybe prod Leper here to join the actual play. We'll see.
Oh.
In the meanwhile, you all have a good one. We'll see you later.